Hey, what is up, guys? And welcome back to Park Ranger Files. And today we are getting into some true scary stories sent in by you guys, the subscribers. And oh boy, do I have some incredible submissions for you today. These are some of the scariest, strangest, and most unsettling things that have ever come into this channel. And every single one of these stories comes straight from the hollows, the ridgelines, the old logging roads, the deep forest, and the dark backwoods of Appalachia. These are real people sharing real experiences, and I think it takes a lot of guts to sit down and write these things out and send them in. So I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to every single subscriber who contributed to this video. You make this channel what it is. And if you want to submit your own story to be read on Park Ranger Files, my email is always in the description below. Check it out. All right, sit back, grab something to drink, grab a snack, turn the lights down if you think you can handle it. And without further ado, let us get into some true, scary Appalachian stories sent in by the subscribers of Park Ranger Files. Story 1. Something was living in the ridge behind our house. This story comes in from a subscriber who grew up in a very small community in eastern Kentucky, back up in a hollow where the nearest neighbor was about a mile and a half down the gravel road. They want to stay anonymous, so we will just call them by their first initial, which is D. D writes in and says the following. I grew up in a holler in eastern Kentucky. My grandmother raised me out there after my mama had to leave for reasons I still don't fully understand. Our house was a small white clapboard thing pressed right up against the ridge. The ridge ran for miles behind us, thick with pine and poplar and laurel, so dense you couldn't see 10 feet into it on a bright summer day. My grandmother always told me two things about that ridge. She said never go up there after dark. And she said, if you ever hear something calling your name from up in those trees, you turn around and you walk back inside, and you do not answer it. I was maybe 7 or 8 when she first told me that, and I remember thinking she just meant animals. Bears, bobcats. I figured she was trying to keep me from wandering off and getting hurt. I did not understand what she actually meant until I was about 12 years old. That summer, my cousin Robbie came to stay with us for about 6 weeks. Robbie was 13 and he was from the city, from Lexington, and he thought everything about where we lived was funny. He thought the dirt road was funny. He thought the well water was funny. He thought my grandmother's habit of leaving a dish of salt on every windowsill was funny. He was always laughing at things. I didn't mind because Robbie was my best friend in the world, even if he was from off. That's what my grandmother called people who came from the city, from off. She'd say Robbie's from off like it explained everything about him. About 3 weeks into his visit, we were out back throwing rocks at a tin can we'd set up on the old wood pile. It was late afternoon and the light was going gold and long through the trees. I remember it perfectly. Robbie stopped mid-throw and tilted his head and said, "Did you hear that?" I listened, and I did hear something. It was coming from the ridge. It was a sound like somebody calling out, not words exactly. Just a long rising call, like somebody hollering across a distance. The way your voice goes when you cup your hands around your mouth and really let it out. Robbie said it was probably just some hiker or somebody out hunting, and I said, people don't really hike up there and hunting season wasn't for another 2 months. He shrugged and threw his rock. It happened again that night. I was half asleep and I heard it through my open window. Same sound, long and rising, and then it dropped and came again. And then I heard my name. D. Just like that. My name. Coming down off the ridge, in that same hollow, calling voice. I sat up in bed and I did not move for a very long time. I thought about what my grandmother had told me. I did not go to the window. I did not answer. I pulled my sheet up and I lay there until I heard my grandmother's footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate. And then I heard her go out onto the back porch. and I heard her say in a voice I had never heard her use before, a low, hard voice. "You go on from here now. You go on." And then nothing. And then I heard her come back inside, and the screen door shut quiet behind her. I never asked her what that was. I think I was afraid of the answer. I think she would have told me the truth, and I wasn't ready for it. What I can tell you is that 2 nights before Robbie went back to Lexington, he woke me up at about 2 in the morning by grabbing my arm. I nearly screamed. He had his hand clamped over my mouth, and he was pointing at my window. The window faced the ridge. There was something standing at the tree line. I could not tell you exactly what it was because the moon was behind clouds, and the dark out there was thick, but it was tall, taller than a man. And it was standing completely still, and it was looking at the house. Or it seemed to be looking at the house. It had no shape that made sense to me. The proportions were wrong. The top of it was too big, and the bottom of it was too narrow. And it was just standing there in the grass at the edge of the trees and not moving at all. Robbie and I lay there probably 45 minutes without saying a word. Then the clouds shifted and the moon came out and the tree line was empty. Nothing there. Just the pines and the dark and the sound of the wind. Robbie did not laugh at my grandmother's salt dishes after that. He didn't laugh at anything much for the rest of his visit. And when his mama came to get him, he hugged my grandmother for a long time before he got in the car. I don't think he ever came back out to visit. We stayed close for years, me and Robbie, but he never wanted to talk about that night. The one time I brought it up, years later, he just said, "Dee, I don't think about that. I need to not think about that." And I let it go. My grandmother passed when I was 22. After the funeral, I was cleaning out her bedroom and I found a small tin box under her bed. Inside, there were about 40 or 50 little bundles of dried herbs tied with red thread and a piece of paper in her handwriting. On the paper was a list of dates going back decades. Dates, and then a short note beside each one. Most of the notes just said, "Sent it off," or "kept it back." The last date on the list was 3 days before Robbie and I saw whatever we saw at the tree line. The note beside that last date said, "It is getting bolder. It is coming closer. I do not know how much longer I can manage it alone." I do not live in Kentucky anymore. I haven't been back to that holler in a long time. I don't know if anyone lives in that house now. I don't know if anyone is out there managing whatever my grandmother spent her whole life managing. I try not to think about what that might mean for the people who might be living there now, whoever they are, going about their lives with no idea what is on the ridge above them. Story 2, the Fetch Road. This submission comes in from a subscriber in Southwest Virginia up near the Tennessee line. They grew up in a small community that they describe as being off any main road you would know by name. They are okay with their first name being shared, so we will call them Marlene. Marlene writes in and says the following: "There is a road in our county that nobody who grew up there calls by its official name. On the county maps, it is listed as something boring and administrative, some number route, but everybody who lives back in that part of the county calls it the Fetch Road. I did not know until I was an adult that fetch was an old word for a kind of apparition, specifically one that looks exactly like a living person, and seeing your own fetch was supposed to mean you were going to die. My grandfather told me that the road got its name because of how many people over the years had seen themselves on it, seen themselves walking along the road when they were somewhere else entirely, or come driving down it and seen themselves standing at the edge of the gravel looking back at the car. My grandfather was not a superstitious man by nature. He was a veteran and a practical person, and he did not go in for much foolishness. So when he told me about the Fetch Road, he wasn't being dramatic. He told me the way he would tell me something factual. He said, "Marlene, that road has got something wrong with it, and always has, and you are best off avoiding it after sundown." And I said, "Pawpaw, have you ever seen anything on it?" And he was quiet for a long minute, and then he said, "I saw your grandmother on it once, walking when she was home in bed, sick with fever, and could not have left the house." That was all he said. I knew better than to push him. I avoided the fetch road most of my childhood just out of habit. It wasn't on the way to anything I needed to get to, and the gravel was rough enough that you'd rather go around anyway. But when I was 17, I started dating a boy named Curtis, whose family lived on a little farm that backed right up to where the fetch road dead-ended. So I started driving it pretty regular, afternoon mostly, going to see him after school. And nothing ever happened to me on it in the daylight. It was just a road, overgrown on both shoulders, old fence posts leaning, hawks sitting on the wire, nothing strange. The one and only time I drove it after dark was the autumn of my senior year. Me and Curtis had stayed out at his place too late, and I had to get home before my parents noticed. It was maybe 9 at night. The road felt different at night in a way I don't know how to fully describe. The headlights caught the trees funny, made everything look like it was right at the edge of the light and just barely back from it, like everything was leaning in slightly toward the car. I had my windows up because it was cold. I remember that clearly. Windows up, heat going, the radio on low. I was about halfway down the road when I saw a figure walking on the shoulder ahead of me, facing away from me, walking in the same direction I was driving. I slowed down because you do, out of courtesy. When you come up on somebody walking on a narrow road at night, you slow down so you don't scare them, and so your headlights aren't blinding them if they turn around. I slowed down and I pulled a little to the left to give them room. The figure was wearing a coat I recognized, a dark green canvas coat with a sheepskin collar. I knew that coat because it was mine. It was hanging in my closet at home right at that moment. I knew every detail of it. The little tear in the left elbow that my mother kept threatening to patch, the way the collar was worn down more on the right side than the left, and the person wearing it had my hair. I could see the back of the head clearly in my headlights, and it was my hair, my exact color, my exact length, my exact way of wearing it pulled back at the base of the neck. I stopped the car. I put it in park, in the middle of the road, and I sat there, and the figure kept walking. It did not turn around. It did not acknowledge the headlights or the sound of the engine. It just kept walking at a perfectly even pace, and I watched it walk until it moved out of the reach of my headlights and the road ahead was empty again. I sat in that car for probably 5 minutes before I could make myself move. Then I drove the rest of that road faster than I should have on gravel, and I got home and I went upstairs and I opened my closet and my green coat was hanging right there where it always was. I am 38 years old now. I have not driven the fetch road after dark since that night. I think about what my grandfather said. I saw your grandmother walking on it when she was home in bed sick. I have been in perfectly good health my whole adult life, and I have no intention of testing whatever that road is doing or what it means when it shows you yourself. My Curtis and I are married now, and we moved off that property a long time ago, and I do not miss being that close to it. Some things you just give a wide berth to. That is what my grandfather would have said. He would have said, Marlene, just give it a wide berth, and he would have said it the way you say something that is both good advice and a warning you hope the other person is smart enough to take. Story 3, The Knocking. This one comes in from a subscriber who currently lives in Western North Carolina, but spent much of their childhood in a house in a remote part of the county that their family has since sold. They asked to remain completely anonymous. They write in and say the following. Our house was 100 and some years old when we lived in it. My parents bought it in the 90s when property out in that part of the county was still cheap enough for a young family to afford. It was a good house structurally, solid, well-built, by whoever put it up all those decades ago. But it had things about it that took some getting used to. The floors talked when you walked on them. The cellar had a smell that never completely went away no matter how much my mother cleaned it. Something dark and wet and old. And starting about a year after we moved in, there was the knocking. The knocking came from inside the wall, Not the ticking and settling that old houses do, which you do get used to eventually, and which has a kind of irregular rhythm that feels organic and random. This was deliberate. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks, a pause. Always 3. Always the same interval between each set. Always the same force, not frantic, not gentle. Deliberate. And it moved. That was the thing that made it impossible to chalk up to pipes or wood contracting in the cold, or any of the things you tell yourself when a house makes sounds. It would start in the kitchen wall and then move along to the hallway wall, and then into the room where my parents slept and then back again. Like something was walking the perimeter of the house inside the walls, knocking as it went, making its circuit. My father was an engineer. He tore into those walls twice looking for whatever was making the sound. He found nothing wrong. No animals that had gotten inside the structure, no mechanical explanation, no pipes running where he didn't expect them. The second time, he opened up a section of the kitchen wall, and while he had it open, while he was standing right there in front of the exposed insulation studs and old wiring, the knocking started. Right there, while he was looking at the open wall. And there was nothing in there making it. The sound was coming from the wall, but there was nothing in the wall to make it. My father closed the wall back up, and he never mentioned the knocking out loud again after that day, but he heard it. We all heard it every single night. My older sister decided when she was about 15 that she was going to knock back. I don't know what she was thinking, and maybe she thought it was funny, or maybe she was just not afraid in the way the rest of us were. She waited one night until the knocking started in the hallway wall outside her bedroom door, and she knocked back on her own wall 3 times. The knocking in the wall stopped immediately and completely. And then after a silence of maybe 30 seconds, it came back, but different. It came back faster. Not 3 and pause, 3 and pause. Just a rapid, continuous knocking, hard, like something slamming its fist flat-palmed against the inside of the wall, up and down the whole length of the hallway at once. And my sister came out of her room screaming, and the whole family stood in the hall while the walls knocked and shook around us for almost a full minute before it stopped. After that, my sister never knocked back again. And after that, the knocking seemed worse in general, more frequent, sometimes louder. My mother started having what she described as very bad feelings in the house, especially at night, especially when she was alone. She started sleeping with the light on. My father, the engineer who had always had a rational explanation for everything, started parking in the driveway instead of in the cellar garage. When I asked him why, he said he just didn't like going down there anymore. He offered no further explanation, and he did not look at me when he said it. The last thing that happened before my parents decided to sell the house was something I have never told anyone except my sister, because I knew nobody would believe me. I was 13. It was a night in February. I woke up and the room was very cold, cold enough that I could see my breath, which did not make sense because the heat was running. I lay there breathing cold air and looking up at the ceiling, and then I realized there was something at my bedroom door. My bedroom door was open about 6 inches, and in the 6 inches of dark space between the door and the frame, there were fingers, just fingers, wrapped around the edge of the door from the other side. Long fingers, too long, pale. And they were moving slowly, flexing, like whatever was holding the door was adjusting its grip or testing the weight of it. And I could hear breathing on the other side, slow and even and too close to the door. I could not move. I want to say I was brave or that I did something, but I could not move. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at those fingers for what felt like a very long time. And then they slid back and the door swung slowly closed, and I heard the knocking start up again, quiet, moving away down the hallway toward the far end of the house. My parents sold that house the following spring. The people who bought it lasted about 14 months before they listed it again. The people after them lasted less than a year. As far as I know, it has changed hands several more times since then. I check on it occasionally. I don't know why I do that. I think part of me wants to know if it is still doing what it was doing when we lived there. I am almost certain that it is. Some things do not stop because the people change. Story 4, the man who came to the door during the flood. This comes in from a subscriber in Tennessee, up in one of the mountain counties. They say this event happened when they were very young, maybe 5 or 6. But they have never forgotten it, and neither has their mother, who is still alive, and who they spoke to before writing in, to make sure they were remembering it correctly. We will call this subscriber by their nickname, which is Birdie. Birdie writes in and says the following. There was a flood when I was little, a real one. The creek behind our house came up over its banks in the night, and by morning the water was in our yard and rising, and my parents were very scared, although they tried not to show it. My daddy was trying to figure out if we needed to leave, and my mama was on the house phone trying to reach her sister, who lived up on higher ground. The line was going in and out. I remember the water out the window looked brown and fast, and there was things floating in it. Wood, a chicken coop. What I thought was a dog, but my mama said was just a bundle of something caught in the current. Somewhere around mid-morning, there was a knock on our front door. My daddy looked out the window, and there was a man standing on our porch. My daddy opened the door. The man was dry. That was the first thing my mama noticed, and she has mentioned it every single time we have talked about this since that day. She said that man was completely dry, and the water was up to his ankles on that porch. It had been raining all night and all morning, and the rain was still coming down hard when my daddy opened that door. And that man's clothes were dry. His hair was dry. He was standing in the rain on a flooded porch, and he was as dry as if he'd just stepped out of a warm house. My daddy asked him what he needed, and the man said he was just checking on us, asking how we were getting on with the water. Daddy said we were managing and asked where the man was from. The man said he was from just up the way. He nodded his head up towards the ridge above our property. Daddy said he didn't recognize him, and my daddy knew everyone in that community. Had grown up right there his whole life, knew every family for miles. But he figured maybe the man had moved in somewhere, and he just hadn't gotten around to meeting him yet. The man stood there talking to my daddy for a few minutes on that porch. He was friendly. He asked after the garden and after our truck, and then he asked whether we'd had any damage to the roof from a storm a few months earlier that had taken some shingles off the back slope. And that last part was the part that made my mama go cold, right where she was standing, listening from the kitchen doorway. She said it because we had lost shingles in that storm, and we had not told a single soul about it, because we hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet, and we didn't want my grandfather to worry about us. She said, how would a man we had never met in our lives know that we had lost shingles off our roof in a specific storm earlier that season? My daddy didn't seem to catch it, or if he caught it, he didn't show it on his face. He finished talking to the man, and the man said, well, you all stay safe now. The water's going to come up another foot. Before it starts going back down, make sure you got your important papers and your photos up above the water line. And then the man stepped off the porch into the water and walked around the side of the house and was gone. My daddy came back inside, and my mama asked him who that was, and my daddy said he didn't rightly know. Said the man must be from up the way somewhere. The water did come up another foot before it started going back down. Exactly as the man had said. Not more. Not less. My mama did not talk about this openly for years. She said it wasn't something she liked to examine too closely. When I was grown and asked her about it directly, she said she believed that man was sent to check on us and to warn us about the water. And she meant that in the way people in that part of the mountains mean it when they say something like that, which is not a human being sent by any human agency. She said she didn't know exactly what that meant or what to make of it theologically, and she didn't particularly care to work it all the way out. She said some things just happen, and you are grateful they do, and you leave it at that. I have never had a good explanation for it. I don't know why he was dry in the middle of a flood and a downpour. I don't know how he knew about our roof. I don't know where he went when he walked around the side of our house into a flooded yard with nowhere to walk to. I know what my mama thinks. I think she is probably right. Story 5. What my uncle saw on Clinch Mountain. This comes in from a subscriber in Tennessee who asks to remain anonymous, but says this story belongs to their family and has been told at family gatherings their entire life. They want it written down somewhere outside the family so it does not get lost. They believe stories like this deserve to be preserved. They write in and say the following. My Uncle Wade was a deer hunter his whole life. He went up into the mountains every season from the time he was old enough to carry a rifle, and he never had anything strange happen to him for most of those years. He was about the most sensible man you would ever meet. He could fix anything with whatever was in his truck bed. He didn't talk much. He had no use for dramatics and even less for liars. So when he told this story at Thanksgiving when I was about 14 years old, and when I watched his face while he told it, I knew something had really happened to him, and that he had been carrying it around for a while, and that he was only telling it now because enough time had passed that he could get the words out without his voice going strange. He had gone up on Clinch Mountain alone. He did that sometimes. He preferred hunting alone because he said other people made too much noise and spooked the deer long before shooting light. He'd set up well before first light and wait for the deer to start moving at dawn. He'd done it 100 times on that mountain over a lifetime. He knew it the way you know your own house, every drainage, every saddle, every old game trail. He was sitting against a big oak in the dark before first light, just sitting quiet, when he heard something moving through the leaves off to his left. His first thought was deer, but the sound was wrong and he knew it immediately. It was too deliberate. Deer move in bursts and pauses. They are careful and irregular. This was moving in a straight line at a perfectly even pace. He sat still and listened, and he adjusted his breathing. The sound got closer. He raised his rifle because whatever he was hearing moving through the leaves was large, and it was displacing leaves the way something very large displaces them. Then it stopped. Whatever it was stopped about 20 feet away from him in the dark. He could hear it breathing. He said it was not a bear, because he had been close to bears and he knew what a bear sounded like in the dark, and this was not that. He said the breathing was wrong. It was too slow and too measured, and there was a quality to it he could not name. Something about the depth of it, the size of the lungs it was coming from. He sat there with his rifle raised and his finger outside the trigger guard, because he was always a careful man and he waited for whatever was going to happen next. Then it spoke to him. He said it was not English, or it was not any language he had ever heard. It was a sound that had the rhythm and cadence of speech, the way you can hear somebody talking through two closed doors and know it is speech, even though you cannot make out a single word. It had that shape, that intention, that structure, and it was aimed at him. He was certain it was aimed at him specifically. He was certain whatever was making that sound was talking to him, and not just making noise. He said the most frightening part was not the sound itself. The most frightening part was that some part of him wanted to answer it. That some deep part of his brain was leaning toward it the way you lean toward a conversation you are only half hearing and try to fill in the missing words. Something in him was trying to parse it. He said he had to actively fight that impulse. He made himself sit completely still and keep his mouth shut. And after a long moment, the breathing started again, and whatever it was moved away from him through the leaves in the same straight, deliberate line, and then the sound faded and the mountain went quiet again. He waited until full daylight before he got up and moved. He looked at the spot where it had been standing. The leaves were pressed down in a way he could not account for. Not paw prints, not boot prints, just pressed down over a large area, like something very heavy had crouched or stood there for a long time. He did not go back to that part of the mountain. He hunted Clinch Mountain for the rest of his life, but he never went back to that particular drainage. He said he wasn't going where he wasn't wanted. He said it exactly like that. The way you say something that is both a little bit of a joke and also absolutely serious. When my grandmother asked him what he thought it was, he said he didn't know and he didn't want to know. And he believed that was probably the correct answer to have about something like that. Uncle Wade passed a few years ago. He was a good man and a reliable one, and I want his story to be somewhere it will not get lost. That is why I am sending it in. So here it is. And before we go to the next story, I want to take a second and say, if you are enjoying Park Ranger Files and you are not subscribed yet, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. We put out new content regular, and every single story on this channel comes from real subscribers sharing real things that happen to them or to people they love. That is what makes this community special. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's keep going. Story 6. The light that came across the field. This submission comes in from a subscriber in West Virginia who grew up in a farming community outside of a small town. They are okay with their first name being shared, so we will call them Patsy. Patsy writes in and says the following. My family farmed. Not a big operation, just enough land to keep ourselves and sell a little at market. Our house sat at the top of a long sloping hayfield, and below the field was a tree line, and below the tree line was the river. You could not see the river from the house, but in the spring when the water was high, you could hear it at night, a low, constant sound. The field between us and the trees was maybe 400 yards across. The lights started appearing when I was about 10 years old. First time I saw one, I thought it was a flashlight, somebody crossing the field at night. And I told my father, and he went out onto the porch and watched for a while. And then he came back inside, and he said it was not a flashlight, because flashlights jerk around and move with the motion of a person walking. And this light moved smooth and steady and did not vary. He said he didn't know what it was, and then he said, I do not want you going out toward it. That was all he said. He did not seem afraid exactly. He seemed like a man who has just been told something he already suspected. The lights came back, not every night, maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, always well after dark, always coming from the tree line, moving slow and smooth up across the field, stopping at various places in the field and hovering still for a while, then moving back down to the tree line and disappearing into it. They were round and whitish yellow, and they did not cast any light on anything around them, the way a flashlight or a lantern would. They lit themselves and nothing else. They were self-contained. My father went to talk to our neighbor Estel, who was an older man who had lived on his farm his entire life, generation after generation of his family on the same ground. He came back and told my mother that Estel said those lights had been crossing that field for as long as he could remember, probably as long as anybody alive could remember, and they had never done harm to anyone or anything, and the only thing he knew about them was that they got more active in the weeks before something bad happened. He said the last time he saw them every single night for a long stretch was the week before the Jenkins boy drowned in the river, and the week before old Mrs. Combs had her stroke down the road. He said he didn't know what the connection was, and he wasn't sure there was one, but that was what he had observed over 60-some years of watching that field. My father thanked Estel and came home and did not talk about the lights much after that conversation, but I noticed he started watching for them the way he watched for bad weather, not afraid, just attentive, the way a farmer watches the sky when the pressure's changing. The lights did get more active the spring that my grandmother got sick. She had a bad heart, and that spring it finally gave out. For about 3 weeks before she passed, those lights came across the field every single night without exception. My father would stand out on the porch and watch them, and I would stand with him sometimes. He never said a word about the connection between the lights and what was happening with my grandmother. I think he did not want to say it out loud, but I knew he saw it. I knew he was counting the nights and watching the field and keeping that to himself. After my grandmother passed, the lights went back to their irregular schedule. Once a week or every 2 weeks, the same as always. My father farmed that land until he was too old to do it, and then we sold it. The family that bought the property had no idea about the lights, and I did not tell them. I did not want to frighten them. But I have always wondered if they see them. I have always wondered if those lights are still going across that field right now, smooth and slow, coming up from the tree line and stopping and going back, doing whatever it is they have been doing on that piece of ground for longer than anyone alive can remember. Story 7, The Hollow Sound. This comes in from a subscriber in northern Georgia, up in the mountain counties near the North Carolina line. They asked to be called by their middle name, which is Clarence. Clarence writes in and says the following. I want to say first that I'm not someone who goes looking for this kind of thing, or who believes easily in things that don't have explanations. I am an accountant. I coached my kids' baseball team for 7 years. I drive a practical vehicle, and I spend my days working with numbers and facts. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand where this story is coming from. I have spent a long time trying to find a rational explanation for what happened, and I have not found one. There is a section of forest on a tract of land my family has owned for 3 generations that I have not entered since I was 19 years old. It is maybe 40 acres of mixed hardwood on the back of the property, sloping down toward a creek. My grandfather called it the Back 40, and so everybody always called it the Back 40. As a child, I played in it all the time without any trouble. I built forts in it. I fished the creek in it. I knew every part of it. Nothing strange ever happened to me anywhere in it until the summer I was 19 years old. That summer, I was home from my first year of college, and I decided to take a long walk through the Back 40 one afternoon just because I hadn't been back there in a few years. It was a clear, hot day, pleasant enough under the tree canopy where the shade was thick. I walked the creek for a while and then started up the slope through the trees. And somewhere up near the top of the slope, in a section where the trees are older and bigger and the undergrowth thins out, I walked into a sound. I don't know how else to describe it. I walked into it. One step I was in normal forest, and the next step I was standing in the middle of something that surrounded me on all sides. It was a low frequency vibration, felt in the chest as much as heard by the ear, the way bass feels inside you when the volume is high enough. But there was no source, no equipment anywhere nearby, no road, no aircraft overhead. Just this low, hollow vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the ground under my feet and the air around me and the bark of the trees themselves. I stood there for a moment, and then I became aware that something else was happening. My thoughts were changing. Not dramatically, not the way it works in movies. More subtle than that. I was becoming very calm in a way that did not feel like my own calm. It felt like something being placed over me. And with the calm came a conviction that I should keep walking, that I should walk further up the slope and into the trees, away from the creek and away from the field and the house, that there was something up there and I needed to see. I cannot tell you exactly where that conviction came from. It was not a voice. It was more like certainty, the way you are sometimes just certain of something without knowing why, or being able to point to the reason. I took one step in the direction the certainty was pulling me, and then something else happened that I think was just luck or stubbornness or some plain dumb instinct that kicked in at the right moment. I recognized that the calm was not mine. I recognized that I had not felt it before I walked into the sound, and that it had come over me at the exact same moment the sound started. And that recognition cut through it enough that I turned around and walked back down the slope and got out of that section of the forest. The sound stopped the moment I was 20 or 30 feet back down the slope. The normal forest came back around me. Birds, wind, my own heartbeat. I stood at the edge of the older trees and looked back up at the spot where I'd been standing, and there was nothing unusual to see. Just trees and shade and leaves. I have not gone back up there since that afternoon. My kids grew up playing in the creek, part of the back 40, and I never told them to stay off the upper slope because I did not want to make them curious about it. They are adults now, and none of them ever mentioned anything strange happening up there. Maybe it comes and goes. Maybe whatever was active that summer afternoon 30 years ago is not active anymore. But I can tell you that the pull I felt toward those trees was stronger than any impulse I have ever experienced in my life. And I have spent 30 years being quietly grateful that I recognized it for what it was just in time to walk away from it. Story 8. She did not open the door. This comes in from a subscriber in Eastern Tennessee who says this is a family story that happened to her great aunt, a woman named Ida, who has been gone for many years now. She says Ida told the story herself many times throughout her life, and the family never doubted a word of it because Ida was, in the subscriber's exact words, the least fanciful person who ever walked the earth. We will call the subscriber by her first name, which is Bet. Bet writes in and says the following. My great-aunt Ida was born in 1921, and she grew up in a very remote part of eastern Tennessee. Her family had a small farm, and they kept mostly to themselves and to the community they had always known. She married at 18 and moved to a house about 3 miles from where she had grown up. Same county, same ridge country, same life she had always known. She was a practical woman in every way. She quilted. She kept an enormous kitchen garden. She did not have much patience for foolishness or for people who saw things that weren't there. The thing Ida talked about happened the winter she was 23. Her husband was away, working at a relative's place for a few weeks in another county, the kind of arrangement that was common back then. She was alone in the house with her 2 young children, a boy of 4 and a baby girl who was not yet a year old. It was the middle of winter and the roads were bad, and the nearest neighbor was about 2 miles down the mountain road. She was woken up in the very early morning before any light at all by the baby crying. She got up and went to the baby and settled her and then stood in the kitchen getting herself a drink of water before going back to bed when she heard something outside the back door, a scratching sound, low and persistent, like something dragging its fingers slowly down the outside of the wood from top to bottom, and then starting again at the top. Ida was not a woman who frightened easily, but she said that sound frightened her immediately and deeply in a way she had never been frightened before. She said it was not an animal sound, though she could not have explained to you precisely why she knew that. She said she just knew it the way you know sometimes without looking that someone has just come into the room behind you. She knew. She did not go to the back door. She went and got the rifle that her husband kept beside the bed, and she came back to the kitchen, and she stood where she could see the back door, and she waited. The scratching continued for a while, and then it stopped. And then she heard footsteps on the back porch, slow and dragging, going along the length of the porch from one end to the other. And then a knock. Not urgent, not frantic. 3 slow, patient knocks. Ida did not answer. She stood with the rifle, and she did not make a sound, and she did not move toward the door. And then she heard a voice. A woman's voice. Soft and very close. Right on the other side of the door, so close it seemed to be pressed against the wood. The voice said, "Honey, it is cold out here. Just let me come in out of the cold. Honey, let me in." Ida said the voice sounded like her mother. Her mother had been dead for 4 years. She said it was not quite exactly her mother's voice. It was like something that had heard her mother speak many times and learned how to make the same sounds, but did not fully understand what gave them meaning. She said the pitch was right and the cadence was right, but it was hollow. That was the word she used every single time she told this story. Hollow. Like something empty making the shape of a sound without the thing inside the sound that makes it real. She did not open the door. She stood there holding that rifle while the voice asked to come in, sometimes in her mother's voice, and sometimes in other voices she did not recognize. for what she said felt like hours. And then around the time the sky started going from black to dark gray, the voice stopped. The footsteps went back across the porch and off the steps. She heard nothing more. When it was full light, she went outside with the rifle. The snow on the porch and in the yard around the house was unbroken. No footprints anywhere. Nothing coming in and nothing going out. Just smooth snow exactly as it had been the night before. Ida told this story until she was in her 80s. She always told it exactly the same way. She never dramatized it, and she never added to it. She would just say there was something on my porch that winter, and it wanted to come in, and I did not let it in, and I believe that was the correct decision. And then she would move on to something else. She was not the kind of woman who dwelt on things. But she kept that rifle in the bedroom until the day she moved into a care facility at 91. And she told my mother once that she kept it not because she thought it would stop something like that if it came back, but because it reminded her that she had stood her ground once, and she could stand her ground again. Story 9, The Children on the Road. The submission comes in from a subscriber in Kentucky who asks to remain entirely anonymous. They say this happened to them personally about 6 years ago. They debated for a long time whether to write in about it. They want it on the record that they are a functioning adult with a stable job and a family, and they are fully aware of how this story is going to read to people who were not there. They write in and say the following: I know how this is going to sound, and I have made my peace with that. I have gone over it 100 times since it happened, and I cannot find an explanation that holds together, and I have tried very hard to find one. I am sending this in because I cannot talk about it with anyone I know, and I need to put it somewhere outside my own head. This happened about 6 years ago in late October. I was driving home from my sister's house, a drive I had made many times through a part of the county that is mostly old farmland and timber and very few houses. It was about 10:30 at night, dark, no moon that I can remember clearly. I had my headlights on, and I was on the narrow 2-lane that cuts back through that part of the county. I came around a curve, and there were children standing in the road. 3 of them. Standing in the road, facing toward my car, facing into my headlights. A girl who looked maybe 10 or 11 in the middle, and a smaller child on either side of her, maybe 6 or 7 years old each. They were dressed in clothes that looked old. Not like Halloween costumes and not like something chosen to look old on purpose. Just actually old. The kind of old where the fabric itself looks different, the cut is different, the weight of the cloth is different. The girl in the middle was in a dress with an apron over it, and her hair was braided, and the children on either side of her were in plain, worn clothing that I would have placed in another century if someone had shown me a photograph. They were not moving. They were just standing in the road, facing my headlights, and they were completely still. I stopped the car. I stopped well before I reached them, and I sat there with my foot on the brake, looking at them through the windshield. And I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I felt afraid. Not the normal startle fear you feel when something unexpected is in the road at night. Something deeper and older than that. The kind that comes up from somewhere below your thoughts, from whatever part of the brain is still responsible for keeping you alive. And it was telling me very clearly that something was wrong. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds looking at those 3 children in the road, and then I put the car in reverse. I don't know exactly why I chose that over getting out or honking or trying to ease around them. I just knew with complete certainty that I should not get out of the car and I should not drive forward. I put it in reverse and I backed down the road until I found a spot wide enough to turn around, and then I took the long way home. 20 extra minutes on the road rather than go forward. The next morning I drove out that way in daylight. The road was empty and normal. There are no houses on that stretch and no farm lanes either. Nowhere those children could have been going or could have come from. The thing I keep coming back to is the girl in the middle. She was facing my car. But after I had been sitting there for a while, I became less and less certain. that she coid see the car at all. The way she was looking was not the way a person looks when they are looking at something. It was the way you look when you are looking at a place where something used to be, or when you are looking at nothing. And she did not blink. Not once in the time I watched her, not once. I don't know what they were. I don't know what would have happened if I had gone forward or gotten out. I know that I did not, and I am glad. That is all I can tell you. Story 10. The Grave Tender. This final submission comes in from a subscriber in the mountain counties of North Carolina, who says they want to share a story they believe is important because it involves a real person who deserves to be remembered properly. We will call the subscriber Wanda, which is the name they signed their letter with. Wanda writes in and says the following. There was an old woman in our community named Effie Pearl, who everybody called Miss Effie. She was very old for as long as I could remember. One of those women who seems to have been born at a certain age and just stayed there, as if time had some kind of arrangement with her that it didn't have with other people. She lived alone on the property where she had been born, and she had never married, and she had no children, and she kept mostly to herself, but she was not unfriendly about it. She would wave when you passed her on the road. She brought things to the community dinners sometimes, a vinegar pie or a jar of sourwood honey or dried beans she'd saved from the season. But she was private, and people who grew up there respected that kind of privacy because they understood it. What Miss Effie was known for in the community was the old graveyard. There was a family cemetery on the ridge above the church, not the regular church cemetery where most people were buried, but an older one that predated the church building by probably 100 years or more. It had graves going back to the 1700s. Most of the stones were barely readable, and some of them were just rough field stones set upright with no markings on them at all, just stone to mark the place. It had been neglected for a long time, the brush growing in over it, the paths between stones disappearing, and then one season Miss Effie started going up there. Nobody asked her to. Nobody assigned it to her. She just started going up with her tools and clearing the brush and keeping the grass down and setting back the stones that had fallen over. She did this for decades. She was still doing it well into her 80s, going up that ridge with her clippers and her gloves. When people asked her why she took on that graveyard, she would say somebody has to remember them. She said it the way you say something that is simply and obviously true. Somebody has to remember them. The strange part, the reason I am writing into Park Ranger Files, is what a neighbor of hers named Roy told my mother sometime after Miss Effie passed. Miss Effie died when I was in my late 20s, peacefully in her own house, in her own bed, which felt right for a woman like her. Roy lived on the property right next to hers, and he had been a good neighbor to her in her last years, checking in on her, making sure she had firewood, and that her pipes hadn't frozen. After she passed and before the estate was settled, Roy agreed to keep an eye on the property. One evening about a week after she died, Roy was walking the fence line between their properties, and he looked up at the ridge and he saw a figure moving in the old graveyard. He thought at first it was somebody from her distant family come to look at the property now that she was gone, but when he looked more carefully, the figure was moving through the graveyard the exact way Miss Effie had always moved through it. Slow and deliberate, stopping at each stone, bending down to clear something away from the base of it, moving on to the next one. The same unhurried pattern Roy had watched Miss Effie work in for years. Roy called out from the fence line. "Hello there," he said. The figure stopped and turned, and Roy said he understood immediately that it was not a person. He could not describe it exactly to my mother or to anyone else who asked him. He said it was like the shape of a person, assembled from the specific light and shade of that place, from the long grass and the old stones in the late afternoon coming through the trees, and it looked at him for a moment. Just looked at him. And then it turned back and kept moving through the graveyard, doing what it had been doing, working its way along the stones, remembering. Roy stood at that fence for a long time and watched. Then he went home. In the morning, he went up to the graveyard in full daylight. It was tidy and tended exactly as Miss Effie had always kept it. The grass around the stones clipped. A fallen stone in the far corner righted and set back in its place. Everything in order. Roy believed it was Miss Effie. Not a ghost in the way people usually picture one when they say that word. He said it wasn't sad and it wasn't frightening. He said the word he kept coming back to was purpose. It looked like purpose. Like she had something to finish and she was finishing it. He believed she was making sure the old dead were still tended before she went wherever she was going. I believe Roy. I believed Miss Effie when she was alive. And I believe the long dead in that graveyard were grateful for her in whatever way the long dead can be grateful, which I think may be more ways than we know. Somebody has to remember them, she always said. I think she was right. I think that is still true. And I think maybe she knew, somewhere deep down, that she had made a promise to those old stones, and she was not going to leave without keeping it. And guys, that is going to do it for today's video. What an incredible group of stories. From Dee up on that ridge in eastern Kentucky to Wanda and Miss Effie in that old graveyard in North Carolina. From Marlene on the fetch road to Roy watching the figure in the evening light. Every one of these came from a real person who sat down and took the time to write it out and send it into Park Ranger Files. And I am so grateful for every single one of you. These are the kinds of stories that get passed around kitchen tables and told at family gatherings and whispered to the person in the next sleeping bag at a campsite. These are the stories of these mountains, of these hollows and ridgelines and old roads and dark fields. And they deserve to be told and preserved and heard. If you have a story of your own, something that happened to you out in the woods, in a campground, on a trail, in an old house, in a hollow somewhere on a dark road, or somewhere you still cannot quite explain, please submit it to Park Ranger Files. The link to submit is right there in the description below. It takes just a few minutes, and your story could be the one I read in the next video. We want your stories. We're always looking for them. Real people, real places, real experiences. And please, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and make sure you are subscribed to Park Ranger Files. Ring that notification bell too, so you never miss when we upload, because we have got a lot more coming. Every like and every subscription helps this channel grow and helps more people find these stories. So share this video with a friend who loves a good scary story. Send it to someone you know who grew up in these mountains. Let's keep building this community together. Thank you so much for being here. You are genuinely the best. Take care of yourselves out there. And I will see you in the next one.